The mud never dried in St. Gethwin's hollow. It clung to everything with the persistence of sin, black and thick as congealed blood, pooling in the deepest parts of the trench where the duckboards had long since rotted through. Private Matthias Cord pressed his back against the firing step, feeling the cold seep through his greatcoat as he adjusted the wick on his lantern. The flame guttered in the still air, casting weak yellow light across the cratered landscape beyond the wire. 4 nights he had walked this section of trench alone. 4 nights since Corporal Brennan had vanished somewhere between the forward listening post and the communication trench that led back to company headquarters. They had found his lantern the next morning, still burning bright as a beacon in the shell-torn earth, the glass chimney uncracked, and the oil reservoir still half full. No blood, no struggle, no body. The same story played out 3 times before that. Sergeant Hoyle gone without trace, his lantern discovered burning steady in a crater 60 yards from his assigned post. Private Lang disappeared from the sap that extended toward enemy lines. His light found burning clean and bright, where the collapsed earthwork met the abandoned wire. Before that, Trooper Vex, his lantern recovered from atop a pile of rubble that used to be a chapel, the flame so steady it might have been tended by unseen hands. Matthias checked his pocket watch by the lantern's glow. 2:30 in the morning, the witching hour his grandmother would have called it, back when he still remembered her face clearly. Back before the war made everything distant and gray. He pulled his rifle closer, though he knew it would do little good against whatever had taken the others. The enemy trenches lay silent 300 yards away across no man's land, their machine gun nests cold and empty. This section of the line had been quiet for weeks, too quiet. The scent hit him as he moved along the trench wall, checking the integrity of the sandbags. Wet parchment. Old paper left too long in damp places, the kind of smell that came from forgotten libraries or abandoned churches. He paused, inhaling despite himself. The odor seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carried on air that barely stirred. It reminded him of something, though he could not place what. Matthias continued his patrol, boots squelching in the perpetual mud. The trench system here followed no rational design. It curved and twisted like the burrows of some massive worm, with sudden turns that led to dead ends or collapsed dugouts. The engineers who had dug St. Gethwin's hollow were long dead, their blueprints lost to shell fire or simply misplaced in the chaos of the war. What remained was a maze that even veteran soldiers struggled to navigate. He reached the forward observation post, a reinforced section of trench where the previous watchers had piled extra sandbags and installed a crude periscope. The device was useless now, its mirror cracked and fogged with moisture, but Matthias still felt compelled to peer through it. The view showed nothing but darkness and the skeletal remains of trees, their branches reaching toward the sky like the fingers of buried giants. Movement caught his eye as he lowered the periscope. Something pale against the blackness beyond the wire, too distant to make out clearly. He raised his field glasses, adjusting the focus with numb fingers. There, perhaps 100 yards out, something tall and motionless stood among the shell craters. At first he thought it might be a destroyed tree or a piece of debris thrown up by artillery, but as he watched it seemed to shift slightly, as if breathing. The figure was draped in what looked like burial shrouds or ceremonial vestments, layers of pale fabric that moved without wind. Its height was wrong, too tall for a man, and its proportions seemed to shift when he was not looking directly at it. When he tried to focus on its face, he saw only shadow beneath the veil. But its arms, or what he took for arms, extended far too long from its sides, and where they touched the ground, dark lines spread outward like the roots of some parasitic plant. Matthias lowered the field glasses and rubbed his eyes. When he looked again, the figure was gone. Only the empty wasteland remained, pocked with craters and strewn with the debris of forgotten battles. He told himself it had been fatigue, or perhaps a trick of the light from his lantern reflecting off metal fragments scattered across no man's land. But the scent of wet parchment had grown stronger, and now he could hear something else beneath the usual night sounds of the trench. Scratching, like fingernails against wood or quill pens against paper. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, from within the packed earth and rotting timber that held back the crushing weight of the soil. As he listened, the sound took on a rhythm, almost like writing, with pauses and flourishes that suggested letters being formed, words taking shape in the darkness behind the trench walls. He pressed his ear to the wooden planking, feeling the vibration through the decaying timber. The scratching was definitely there, not imagination or the settling of disturbed earth. Something was moving within the walls, working with deliberate purpose. He thought of the stories soldiers told around braziers when the nights grew long, tales of the trench ghosts that supposedly haunted the deepest parts of the line. Spirits of the dead who had been buried alive when shells collapsed their positions, forever trying to claw their way back to the surface. But this sound was different, more methodical, more purposeful, like the work of a scholar bent over ancient texts, transcribing knowledge that should not be preserved. Matthias moved away from the wall and continued his patrol, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over him like a burial shroud. The lantern's flame flickered as he walked, casting dancing shadows that seemed to take on lives of their own. Each pool of darkness beyond the light's reach could hide anything. Each turn in the trench might reveal something that had no business existing in the world of the living. The communication trench that led back toward company headquarters branched off to his left, but standing orders were clear. Night watchmen were to maintain their posts until relieved at dawn. No exceptions. Too many soldiers had abandoned their positions claiming supernatural encounters, only to leave gaps in the line that enemy raiders could exploit. Command had made it clear that cowardice would be met with summary execution, regardless of what phantoms a man claimed to have seen. So Matthias walked his section of trench alone, listening to the scratching in the walls and breathing air that tasted of old paper and forgotten prayers. His grandmother had told him once that the dead could not rest until their stories were finished, until every word they had meant to speak was finally spoken. He wondered what stories were being written in the darkness behind the trench walls and what would happen when they were complete. The hours passed with agonizing slowness. Each time he checked his pocket watch, only minutes had elapsed, though it felt like he had been walking for days. The lantern's oil burned lower, the flame growing smaller and more unstable. Soon he would need to refill it from the reserve can back at his dugout, but he found himself reluctant to leave this section of trench unguarded. Something important was happening here, something that required witness. The scratching grew louder as the night wore on, joined by other sounds that defied explanation. A rustling like pages being turned, a soft tapping like rain on a roof, though the sky remained clear. And beneath it all, a susurrus of whispered words in a language he did not recognize but somehow understood. The words spoke of endings and beginnings, of cycles that turn like millstones grinding the world to dust. When dawn was still hours away, Matthias made a discovery that changed everything. While examining a section of trench wall that had partially collapsed under recent rainfall, he noticed something pale protruding from the black earth. At first he thought it might be a bone, perhaps the remains of some previous defender, but when he brushed away the mud, he revealed the corner of a stone tablet. The tablet was carved from some white stone that seemed to glow faintly in the lantern light. Its surface was covered with text, but the letters were wrong, formed backward as if reflected in a mirror. He could not read the words, but their shapes seemed familiar, like half-remembered prayers from childhood. As he knelt in the mud, carefully excavating more of the tablet, he began to hear something that made his blood run cold. Singing, faint and distant, but unmistakably human voices raised in harmony. The melody was beautiful and terrible, a hymn that spoke of devotion twisted into something unrecognizable. The words were the same backward script carved into the tablet, and as the voices sang, Matthias found himself beginning to understand their meaning. They sang of a saint who had loved too deeply, who had sought to serve the divine with such fervor that she had burned away everything human within herself. They sang of prayers offered so constantly that they lost all meaning, becoming mere sounds that attracted things that dwelt in the spaces between words. They sang of faith that had grown so pure it had become poison, consuming the believer from within until only hunger remained. The tablet was larger than he had first realized. As he dug, more and more of it emerged from the earth, until he realized he was uncovering not just a tablet but an altar. The stone was carved with channels that led to a central depression, paths for liquid to flow during some ancient ceremony. The channels were stained dark with something that was not mud, something that had soaked into the stone so deeply it had become part of its substance. The singing grew louder as he worked, the voices multiplying until it sounded like an entire congregation hidden somewhere in the earth around him. But there were no people here, no choir gathered in the darkness. The voices came from the stone itself, from the backward words carved into its surface. They were the echoes of prayers spoken so many times they had worn grooves in reality, creating channels through which devotion could flow like blood from an opened vein. Matthias realized he was no longer alone in the trench. The tall figure had returned, standing now at the edge of his lantern's light. This close, he could see that its limbs were indeed like roots, pale and branching, spreading through the air as if drawing sustenance from some invisible soil. The shrouds that covered it were not fabric, but something organic, layers of membrane that pulsed with a rhythm like breathing or heartbeat. The figure had no face beneath its veil, only a hollow space filled with the same backward text that covered the altar. Words flowed across the darkness where features should have been, prayers and litanies and confessions all written in reverse, as if the being was trying to undo every holy word ever spoken. As Matthias watched, paralyzed by a terror that went deeper than fear, he saw his own name appear among the flowing text, spelled backward like everything else. The gospel leech. The name came to him unbidden, whispered by voices that might have been memory or might have been the stone altar itself. It had been a saint once, Saint Gethwin herself, the blessed martyr for whom this section of trench was named. She had prayed so fervently for the souls of the dying that she had drawn the attention of things that fed on faith. They had filled her with their hunger, transformed her devotion into a need that could never be satisfied. Now she moved through the trenches at night, drawn to the lanterns that burned with the same steady flame as the candles she had once lit in prayer. She sought those who carried light in the darkness, those who still held some fragment of belief that she could consume. The soldiers who had vanished had not been killed but transformed, their faith drained away until only empty shells remained, shells that crumbled to nothing when the dawn touched them. The scratching in the walls grew frantic now, and Matthias understood that it was the sound of names being written, the names of all those who had been taken, their identities being transcribed in the backward script, that unmade meaning. His own name was being carved even now, letter by letter, each stroke of the unseen quill drawing him deeper into the gospel leech's embrace. He tried to run, but his legs would not obey him. The mud that had seemed merely inconvenient before now felt like quicksand, holding him fast as the terrible saint approached. The altar beneath his knees pulsed with warm light, the stained channels beginning to flow with something that was not quite blood and not quite water. The backward prayers carved into its surface glowed brighter, each reversed word pulling meaning from the world around it. The gospel leech reached out with limbs that branched and divided like blood vessels, and where they touched him, Matthias felt his memories beginning to fade. Not disappear entirely, but reverse themselves, unraveling backward through time until he could no longer remember why he had joined the war, why he had left home, even his own mother's face. Each touch drained away another piece of who he had been, leaving only empty spaces that the saint's hunger rushed to fill. As the transformation began, Matthias felt his lips moving of their own accord, speaking prayers he had learned as a child, but in reverse, each holy word becoming its opposite. He was becoming another voice in the choir that sang from the stone, another echo of devotion twisted into something that devoured rather than blessed. The lantern at his feet guttered and died, but somehow the light continued, emanating now from his own flesh as it grew pale and translucent. The last thing he remembered as himself was the scent of wet parchment and the understanding that it came from pages being written, even as others were being erased. Somewhere in the walls of the trench, his story was being transcribed in backward script, joining the countless others who had been taken by St. Gethwin's transformed love. But the story would never end, could never end, because each word written in reverse created the need for more words to be unwritten. When dawn came, the relief patrol found only an empty trench and a lantern burning bright in the mud. The flame was steady and clean, as if it had been burning for days without any need for oil or tending. None of them noticed the new section of carved stone that protruded slightly from the trench wall, its surface covered in backward script that hurt to look at directly. That night, Private Henderson drew the watch duty for St. Gethwin's Hollow. He was a practical man, skeptical of ghost stories and supernatural nonsense. He carried his lantern with confidence, whistling old marching songs to keep his spirits up as he walked the empty trench. The mud squelched under his boots, and the air carried the faint scent of wet parchment, but these seemed like minor inconveniences rather than omens. It was not until well after midnight that he noticed the scratching in the walls. The sound of Henderson's whistling died away as he pressed his ear to the wooden planking, trying to locate the source of the noise. Like Matthias before him, he could feel the vibration through the timber, the methodical scratch and scrape of something working with purpose. But where Matthias had been unnerved by the sound, Henderson found it almost comforting. It reminded him of his father's workshop, of the steady rhythm of tools shaping wood. He moved along the trench wall, following the sound as it seemed to travel through the earth. It led him to the section where the altar protruded from the collapsed wall, though he did not recognize it for what it was. To his eyes, it appeared to be nothing more than a piece of decorative stonework, probably part of some old chapel that had been destroyed and buried during the construction of the trench system. The carved text covering its surface looked like decoration to him, elaborate scrollwork of the kind that adorned old churches. He traced the backward letters with his finger, finding their reversed forms strangely soothing. They seemed to pulse under his touch, warm despite the cold of the trench, and he found himself wondering what they might say if he could read them properly. The singing began as he knelt beside the altar, but Henderson heard it as wind through the broken timbers of the trench walls. The voices that had terrified Matthias sounded to him like the natural music of moving air, a phenomenon he had observed many times in partially collapsed buildings. He settled more comfortably in the mud, using the altar as a backrest as he continued his watch. The gospel leech approached through the darkness beyond his lantern's reach, but Henderson perceived only a trick of shadows and mist. The pale figure that had filled Matthias with existential dread appeared to his practical mind as nothing more than a piece of torn canvas caught on the wire, shifting in a breeze too faint to feel. Even when the saint drew close enough that her root-like limbs cast clear shadows on the trench walls, Henderson dismissed what he saw as the play of firelight on rough stone. It was not that Henderson was blind to the supernatural. Rather, the gospel leech had learned to appear differently to each victim, manifesting in whatever form would draw them closer rather than drive them away. Where Matthias had seen terror, Henderson saw familiarity. Where one man found horror, another discovered comfort. The saint's hunger was patient and adaptive, changing to suit the faith she wished to consume. As Henderson dozed against the altar, his lantern burning steady at his feet, the backward prayers carved into the stone began their work. But instead of the violent reversal that had claimed Matthias, Henderson experienced a gentler unmaking. His memories did not flee but transformed, becoming warmer and more pleasant than they had ever been in life. The war disappeared from his recollection, replaced by memories of peaceful days in his father's workshop, of tools that sang as they worked. Think of prayers spoken in reverse, because that was simply how prayers were meant to be spoken. The transformation took hours rather than minutes, a slow dissolution that felt like falling asleep rather than dying. Henderson's body grew pale and translucent, his flesh taking on the same luminous quality as the saint who remade him. But he experienced this change as a return to health, as if he were recovering from a long illness that had kept him from seeing the world clearly. When the process was complete, Henderson stood and picked up his lantern, continuing his patrol as if nothing had changed. But now he walked with the same root-like gait as the gospel leech, his feet sending out tendrils that spread through the mud of the trench floor. The scratching in the walls grew louder, and he could hear it clearly now as the sound of his own name being written in reverse, joined by countless others in a litany of the transformed. The relief patrol found the trench empty at dawn, with only Henderson's lantern burning in the mud to mark where he had been. But, unlike the previous disappearances, there were signs that something had been at work during the night. The section of altar protruding from the wall had grown larger, more of its surface exposed to the air. The backward script covering it had deepened, as if the letters were carving themselves more firmly into the stone. And in the mud around the altar, new growth had appeared. Black vines twisted up from the earth, their leaves shaped like pages torn from ancient books. They bore no flowers, but their stems wept, a substance that looked like ink mixed with blood, drops that fell onto the altar's surface and were absorbed instantly into the hungry stone. The next soldier assigned to night watch was Corporal Davies, a man who had seen too much combat to be easily frightened. He approached St. Gethwin's Hollow with the weary competence of a veteran, checking his equipment methodically before beginning his patrol. The lantern's flame burned bright and steady, casting its circle of yellow light across the twisted landscape of the trench. Davies noticed the altar immediately, his experienced eye recognizing it as something that did not belong in a military fortification. The carved text covering its surface seemed to move in the lantern light, the backward letters shifting and rearranging themselves as he watched. He had seen similar phenomena before, in the ruins of churches that had been shelled during the war. Sometimes the blast of artillery would reveal older structures beneath, remnants of faiths that predated the current conflict by centuries. But this altar was different. It seemed to pulse with its own inner light, the stained channels that covered its surface flowing with something that was definitely not rainwater. As Davies watched, drops of the dark substance fell upward from the altar's surface, defying gravity as they rose into the air and disappeared into the darkness above. The sight should have been impossible, but Davies had learned that the war made impossible things commonplace. The gospel leech materialized slowly, her form taking shape from the shadows between trenches like an image developing in a photographer's bath. To Davies, she appeared as she truly was, without disguise or illusion. He saw the pale, root-like limbs that spread through the air around her, drawing sustenance from sources invisible to mortal eyes. He saw the hollow space beneath her veil where a face should have been, filled with the constant flow of backward text. He saw the way reality bent around her presence, making the straight lines of the trench walls curve and the solid earth of the floor ripple like water. But Davies was too tired to be afraid. He had seen entire companies disappear in the space between one artillery barrage and the next. He had watched friends die choking on poison gas, their faces melting like wax in the chemical rain. He had killed men with his bare hands when ammunition ran low, feeling their life drain away through his fingers. After experiences like those, the sight of a transformed saint seemed almost mundane. Davies set his lantern on the altar and sat down in the mud, his back against the carved stone. The backward prayers pressed against his spine, their reversed meaning seeping into his body like heat from a fire. He could feel his memories beginning to shift, experiences rearranging themselves into new patterns that made more sense than the originals ever had. The war became not a tragedy, but a necessary winnowing, separating those who were meant to survive from those who were always destined to feed the hungry earth. The transformation that claimed Davies was different from those who had come before. Where Matthias had fought the change and Henderson had been gently deceived by it, Davies embraced it willingly. He understood that the gospel leech offered not death but transformation, not an ending but a new beginning. The saint's hunger was not malicious, but necessary, part of a cycle that had been turning since before the first prayer was ever spoken. As his flesh grew pale and luminous, Davies felt the root tendrils spreading from his feet into the earth below. They connected him to a vast network that extended throughout the trench system, linking him to every other soul that had been claimed by the saint's love. He could feel their presence like distant stars, each one a point of light in a constellation of transformed faith. The scratching in the walls reached a crescendo as Davy's name was carved in reverse beside all the others. But now he could hear it clearly for what it was, the sound of a great work nearing completion. Each name added to the litany brought the saint closer to her goal, though what that goal might be remained hidden even from those who served her. When dawn came, the relief patrol found something that made them radio immediately for the chaplain. The altar had grown again during the night, more of its surface emerging from the earth, like a great stone flower blooming in reverse. The backward script covering it now formed recognizable patterns, prayers and hymns and confessions, all written in mirror image. And around the altar, the black vines had spread into a garden of paper, leaves, and ink stems, each plant growing from soil that had been enriched by the dissolution of human faith. Chaplain Mortius arrived at St. Gethwin's Hollow as the sun reached its zenith, casting harsh shadows across the broken landscape. He was a man who had served in many wars, who had spoken the last rites over soldiers in 12 different languages. His faith was a practical thing, tested by years of witnessing suffering that challenged any belief in divine mercy. He carried with him a satchel of blessed implements, tools sanctified for the destruction of unholy things. The altar drew his attention immediately, its backward script causing his trained eye to water and blur. He recognized some of the reversed prayers, litanies, that he had spoken countless times but had never seen written in mirror image. The effect was deeply unsettling, like hearing his own voice played backward until familiar words became meaningless sounds. The black vines troubled him more than the altar itself. They were clearly unnatural, their paper leaves rustling with sounds like whispered confessions and their ink stems weeping substances that stained the earth in patterns that hurt to contemplate. As he watched, new growth pushed up from the mud, fed by nutrients that no earthly plant should have been able to process. Mortius opened his satchel and withdrew a vial of blessed water, one of several he carried for the cleansing of corrupted ground. But as he unstopped the container, the liquid inside began to bubble and steam, turning from clear to black in the space of a heartbeat. The transformation spread to the other blessed implements in his satchel, holy water curdling, sanctified oil turning rancid, silver crosses tarnishing until they resembled pieces of charcoal. The gospel leech emerged from the shadows between trenches as Mortius knelt beside the altar, trying to understand what force could corrupt blessed implements so completely. She appeared to him not as monster or saint, but as a mirror of his own faith, showing him what devotion looked like when stripped of all human weakness and limitation. Her root-like limbs spread through the air around her, and where they touched the walls of the trench, more backward script appeared, carved into the wood and stone by invisible hands. Mortius found himself reading the reversed prayers aloud, his voice speaking the familiar words in their new inverted form. As he spoke, he began to understand what the gospel leech truly was and what she offered. She was faith purified beyond all mortal comprehension, devotion so intense that it had burned away everything except the essential core of belief. She offered the same purification to others, the chance to serve the divine without the complications of flesh or doubt. The chaplain's transformation was the most gradual of all. taking place over the course of hours as he knelt beside the altar and spoke the backward prayers. His faith did not reverse, but rather inverted itself, becoming something that drew meaning from its own negation. He understood that every prayer spoken correctly required another prayer spoken in reverse to balance it, that every blessing demanded a corresponding curse to maintain the equilibrium of creation. As the sun set and his flesh began to glow with the same pale light as the saint he now served, Mortius felt his connection to the Orthodox Church severing like a rope under tension. But in its place came a deeper connection, a link to truth that existed beneath the surface of conventional religion. He could feel the vast network of transformed souls that extended throughout the trench system, each one a node in a web of inverted faith that grew stronger with every addition. The scratching in the walls reached a new intensity as Mortius's name joined the litany, carved in reverse beside the hundreds of others who had been claimed. But now the sound was no longer random or chaotic. It had become organized, purposeful, working towards some grand design that remained hidden from mortal understanding. When the next patrol arrived to relieve the night watch, they found St. Gethwin's Hollow transformed beyond recognition. The altar now dominated the center of the trench, its surface covered entirely with backward script that seemed to move and shift in the light of their lanterns. The black vines had grown into a forest of paper and ink, their leaves whispering in languages that predated human speech. And standing among the vines, pale and luminous as moonlight, were the figures of all those who had been taken. They moved with the slow grace of deep-sea creatures, their root-like limbs spreading through the air as they tended their impossible garden. Their faces, where faces could still be discerned, bore expressions of rapture that transcended human emotion. The patrol turned and fled, their lanterns bouncing wildly as they ran through the twisting passages of the trench system. Behind them, the sound of backward prayers followed like pursuing hounds, each word pulling meaning from the world and leaving emptiness in its wake. By the time they reached company headquarters, half of them had forgotten why they were running, and the other half could no longer remember their own names. Command sealed St. Gethwin's Hollow within hours, posting guards at every entrance to the section of trench where the altar had been discovered. Official reports listed the area as contaminated by poison gas, a plausible explanation that would keep curious soldiers away. But the guards assigned to maintain the perimeter began reporting strange phenomena within days of taking up their posts. Scratching sounds echoed through the sealed passages, growing louder each night. The air around the entrances smelled of wet parchment and old prayers, scents that seemed to seep through solid stone and timber. Worst of all, the guards began to find their own equipment changing. Lanterns that burned oil began burning something else, something that produced pale light and cast shadows that moved independently of their sources. Rifles developed a patina of rust that formed patterns resembling backward script. Even their uniforms began to show signs of alteration, the fabric taking on a luminous quality that made it glow faintly in darkness. The corruption spread slowly but inexorably beyond the sealed area. Soldiers in adjacent sections of trench reported difficulty sleeping, plagued by dreams in which they heard beautiful singing that made no sense when they tried to remember the words. Some began sleepwalking, found by their comrades standing at the barriers that blocked access to St. Gethwin's Hollow, their faces turned toward the sealed passages with expressions of longing. Military chaplains were brought in to perform exorcisms and blessing rituals, but their efforts only seemed to accelerate the spread of the contamination. Holy water turned black at their touch. Blessed silver melted like wax when exposed to the air near the sealed area. Prayer books opened themselves to pages covered in backward script that made the chaplains weep tears of ink. Within a month, command was forced to abandon the entire section of trench line that surrounded St. Gethwin's Hollow. The area was designated as a dead zone, officially lost to enemy action but actually quarantined against something far more dangerous than conventional warfare. Artillery was used to collapse the passages, burying the altar and its garden of impossible vines under tons of earth and debris. But the gospel leech could not be so easily contained. She had been a saint once, blessed with the power to move between the world of flesh and the realm of spirit. Transformation had not destroyed that ability, but had enhanced it, allowing her to exist simultaneously in multiple states of being. The collapse of the trenches merely forced her to find new pathways, new routes through which her influence could spread. She began appearing in the dreams of soldiers throughout the war zone, manifesting as a figure of pale light that spoke in reverse the prayers they had learned as children. Each dreamer who encountered her carried away some fragment of her hunger, a seed of inverted faith that would grow in the darkness of their sleeping minds. They would wake with the taste of wet parchment in their mouths and the sound of scratching in their ears, marks of their conscription into her growing congregation. The war continued around St. Gethwin's Hollow, but the nature of the conflict began to change in subtle ways. Soldiers on both sides reported encounters with figures that glowed with pale light, beings that moved through no man's land without regard for barbed wire or machine gun fire. These entities did not kill, but instead offered transformation, whispering invitations in backward prayers that promised peace through dissolution. Battle lines became fluid in the area around the sealed hollow, with positions changing hands not through combat, but through mysterious disappearances. Entire units would vanish overnight, leaving behind only their equipment and personal effects arranged in patterns that resembled altars. The abandoned gear glowed with the same pale light as the figures that haunted the dreams of survivors, and touching it caused the same backwards corruption that had claimed the blessed implements of Chaplain Mortius. High Command attempted to suppress reports of the phenomena, but word spread through the ranks with the persistence of a plague. Soldiers began requesting transfers away from the affected zone, claiming that the very air there made them forget their own names. Some deserted entirely, disappearing into the countryside rather than face whatever was growing in the darkness beneath St. Gethwin's Hollow. But even desertion offered no escape. The gospel leech's influence followed the fleeing soldiers, manifesting in their dreams wherever they tried to hide. She appeared to them as she had appeared to each of her previous victims, taking whatever form would draw them closer to the transformation she offered. Some saw her as a figure of divine mercy, others as a promise of rest from the horrors of war. But always she spoke the same backward prayers, the same inverted litanies that rewrote faith from foundation to pinnacle. The network of transformed souls continued to grow, spreading beyond the confines of the original trench system as new converts joined the gospel leech's congregation. They moved through the world like antibodies in infected blood, carrying the contagion of reversed prayer to every corner of the war zone. Each person they touched became another node in the expanding web, another voice in the choir that sang reality backward into new configurations. Cities began to report strange occurrences as the influence spread beyond the battlefield. Churches found their holy water turning black overnight, their prayer books opening to pages covered in mirror script. Priests discovered that their most sacred rituals had been subtly altered, traditional words replaced with backward versions that carried opposite meanings. The faithful who attended services began experiencing visions of a pale saint who promised salvation through surrender, redemption through dissolution. The gospel leech herself appeared more frequently as her power grew, manifesting not just in dreams, but in the waking world as well. She was seen in the ruins of destroyed churches, standing among the rubble with her root-like limbs spread wide, as if embracing the devastation. She appeared in military hospitals, moving between the beds of wounded soldiers and speaking backward comforts that eased their pain by making them forget they had ever been whole. Each manifestation left behind traces of her presence, signs that the boundary between faith and hunger was dissolving. Stone angels in graveyards turned their faces away from heaven and began weeping tears of ink. Crosses inverted themselves without human intervention, their arms reaching toward the earth instead of the sky. Even the most sacred relics began to show signs of corruption, holy bones growing pale and luminous as they took on the characteristics of the saint who had once blessed them. The war itself began to transform under the gospel leech's influence, becoming something that existed as much in the realm of spirit as in the physical world. Battles were fought not just with bullets and shells, but with competing versions of reality, each side trying to impose its own understanding of what the conflict meant. The traditional boundaries between enemy and ally, between the living and the dead, between the sacred and the profane, all began to blur as the backward prayers rewrote the fundamental nature of existence. In the deepest part of what had once been St. Gethwin's Hollow, buried beneath tons of collapsed earth and broken timber, the altar continued its work. The backward script carved into its surface glowed with increasing intensity, each letter drawing power from the growing network of transformed souls. The channels that covered its surface flowed with substances that were no longer entirely physical, liquids that existed in the spaces between matter and meaning. The black vines had survived the collapse, their paper leaves and ink stems finding ways to grow through the smallest cracks in the debris. They formed a hidden garden in the buried darkness, each plant fed by the faith that was being drained from the world above. Their rustling whispers carried fragments of every prayer that had ever been spoken in reverse, creating a library of inverted devotion that grew more complete with each passing day. Lieutenant Colonel Wainwright stood at the edge of the exclusion zone, watching the morning mist rise from the scarred earth that had once been St. Gethwin's Hollow. 3 months had passed since the last reports of supernatural activity, 3 months of blessed silence that had allowed command to convince themselves that the threat had been contained. But Wainwright knew better. He had seen the reports that were never filed, the testimonies that were quietly buried alongside the soldiers who had given them. The corruption had not been destroyed, merely driven deeper. Like water seeking its level, the gospel leech's influence had found new channels through which to flow. Military hospitals across the theater of operations reported increasing numbers of patients who spoke in their sleep, reciting prayers in languages that changed meaning with each repetition. Field chaplains discovered that their most sacred ceremonies had been subtly altered, traditional words replaced with versions that carried opposite intent. Wainwright pulled his greatcoat tighter against the morning chill and began his inspection of the perimeter. The guards posted around the exclusion zone were rotated weekly, a precaution that had proven insufficient to prevent the gradual erosion of their sanity. Each man who served a tour of duty at St. Gethwin's Hollow returned to his unit subtly changed, carrying with him dreams of pale figures and the persistent scent of wet parchment. The observation post overlooked the crater where the altar had been buried, though recent rainfall had exposed what might have been fragments of carved stone. Wainwright raised his field glasses and adjusted the focus, studying the debris field for any sign of the impossible garden that intelligence reports claimed still flourished in the buried darkness. The landscape appeared barren, but something about its emptiness felt deliberate, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. Movement caught his attention as he scanned the crater's edge. A figure in a military uniform was picking its way carefully among the shell holes, moving with the slow deliberation of someone who knew exactly where they were going. Wainwright could not make out the soldier's face at this distance, but something about the way the figure moved sent ice through his veins. The gait was too steady, too purposeful for someone navigating treacherous ground. The soldier disappeared into a fold in the terrain, but Wainwright continued to watch the spot where he had vanished. Minutes passed with no sign of movement, then suddenly the figure emerged from an entirely different location, as if he had traveled through solid earth rather than around it. This time he was close enough that Wainwright could see his face clearly through the field glasses. It was Private Henderson, the soldier who had vanished from night watch duty months ago. But Henderson's face was wrong, pale and luminous in the morning light, his eyes reflecting the sky like pools of still water. He moved with the same root-like grace that Wainwright had seen in classified photographs, his feet sending out tendrils that spread through the mud with each step. Henderson looked directly at the observation post, and Wainwright felt the weight of that gaze like a physical blow. The soldier's lips moved in what might have been speech, but the words that reached Wainwright's ears were spoken in reverse, familiar prayers rendered meaningless by their inverted structure. As Henderson spoke, the air around him began to shimmer, reality bending like heat waves rising from summer pavement. More figures emerged from the crater, soldiers in uniforms from different units, different time periods, some wearing equipment that predated the current conflict by decades. They moved with the same unnatural grace as Henderson, their pale faces turned toward the observation post with expressions of patient hunger. Among them walked a tall figure draped in burial shrouds, her root-like limbs spreading through the air as she led her congregation toward the perimeter of the exclusion zone. Wainwright grabbed the field telephone and cranked the handle with trembling fingers. The operator's voice crackled through the speaker, distorted by static that formed patterns resembling backward script. He tried to report what he was seeing, but found that the words would not come. Each time he attempted to speak, his voice produced only the reversed prayers he had heard Henderson reciting. The gospel leech and her followers reached the wire that marked the boundary of the exclusion zone, but they did not stop. The barriers that had been erected to contain them dissolved at their touch, the metal posts crumbling to rust and the warning signs fading until their letters rearranged themselves into mirror images of their original messages. The transformed soldiers walked through the obstacles as if they were made of morning mist, their pale forms leaving no trace of their passage except for the black vines that sprouted from their footprints. Wainwright abandoned the observation post and ran toward the communication trench, his boots slipping in mud that had taken on the consistency of wet parchment. Behind him, the sound of backward prayers followed like pursuing wolves, each word pulling meaning from the world and leaving emptiness in its wake. He could feel his own memories beginning to shift, experiences rearranging themselves into new patterns that made more sense than the originals ever had. The communication trench led to a bunker complex where the garrison maintained their radio equipment. But as Wainwright descended into the tunnels, he realized that the geography of the underground passages had changed. Corridors that should have led to familiar rooms now opened onto chambers he had never seen before. Spaces carved from living rock and lined with the same backward script that covered the buried altar. In the deepest chamber, Wainwright found the radio room, but the equipment had been transformed beyond recognition. The metal chassis of the transmitters had grown pale and luminous, their surfaces covered with the same root-like patterns that marked the Gospel Leech's followers. The radio operators sat at their stations with expressions of rapture, their hands moving over controls that had been replaced with organic keyboards made of bone and sinew. The operators turned to look at Wainwright as he entered, and he saw that their eyes had become pools of backward text, words flowing across their corneas in patterns that hurt to contemplate. They spoke in unison, their voices reciting transmission codes that had been inverted until they called down benedictions rather than artillery strikes. The radio equipment responded to their twisted prayers, sending out signals that carried not military intelligence but fragments of the Gospel Leech's hunger. Wainwright tried to flee, but found that his legs would no longer obey him. The mud that covered the floor of the chamber held him fast, and he realized that it was not mud at all, but the dissolved remains of countless soldiers who had been drawn into the saint's embrace. Their essence had been absorbed into the earth itself, becoming part of the network that fed the Gospel Leech's growing power. The transformation that claimed Wainwright was swift and merciful, his consciousness dissolving like sugar in water as the backward prayers rewrote the fundamental nature of his existence. He felt his memories becoming fluid, his identity spreading out through the network of transformed souls until he was no longer a single person, but part of a vast collective that thought with 1,000,000 minds and dreamed with 1,000,000 sleeping souls. In the world above, the Gospel Leech's influence continued to spread, carried by soldiers who had been touched by her presence and civilians who had encountered her followers. Each person who heard the backward prayers became another node in the expanding web, another voice in the choir that sang reality into new configurations. Churches found their congregations transforming, their faithful speaking familiar words in unfamiliar patterns that changed the meaning of everything they had once believed. The war that had given birth to the Gospel Leech began to transform as well, becoming something that existed as much in the realm of spirit as in the physical world. Battles were fought not just with conventional weapons but with competing versions of truth, each side trying to impose its own understanding of what existence meant. The traditional boundaries between life and death, between the sacred and the profane, between meaning and meaninglessness, all began to blur as the backward prayers rewrote the fundamental laws of creation. In hospitals across the continent, patients began speaking in their sleep, reciting prayers they had never learned in languages they had never heard. The words changed meaning with each repetition, becoming more beautiful and more terrible as they approached perfect incomprehension. Doctors who tried to study the phenomena found their medical texts rewriting themselves, symptoms and treatments inverting until healing became a form of controlled dissolution. The Gospel Leech herself appeared more frequently as her power grew, manifesting not just in the war zone but in the capitals of nations, in the hearts of cities where millions of people carried fragments of faith that she could claim. She was seen in the great cathedrals, standing among the ruins of conventional belief with her root-like limbs spread wide as if embracing the devastation she had wrought. She appeared in the dreams of world leaders, offering them visions of peace through surrender, of unity through the dissolution of individual identity. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the gospel leech's influence was how natural it seemed to those who encountered it. The backward prayers did not sound wrong to ears that had been prepared by exposure to her presence. The inverted meanings appeared more true than the original words they replaced. The transformation she offered felt like a return to health rather than a descent into madness, as if the conventional world had been the aberration and her realm of reverse devotion was the natural state of existence. Children born in the affected areas emerged from their mothers' wombs already speaking the backward prayers, their first words carrying meanings that their parents could not comprehend but somehow understood. They grew with an intuitive knowledge of the gospel leech's truth, seeing the world as it truly was rather than as it pretended to be. Their eyes reflected the same pale light as the saints' followers, and their laughter sounded like the rustling of paper leaves in an impossible garden. The black vines continued to spread through the root systems of ordinary plants, their paper leaves and ink stems contaminating forests and fields with their presence. Where they grew, the very soil became sanctified in reverse, producing crops that nourish the body while draining the soul. Animals that fed on the contaminated vegetation began to glow with the same pale light, their behavior changing as they joined the growing network of transformed consciousness. Time itself began to flow differently in the areas where the gospel leech's influence was strongest. Moments stretched into hours, while days compressed into heartbeats. The past and future became fluid, events occurring in sequences that defied causality, as the backward prayers rewrote the fundamental nature of temporal existence. Clocks ran backward, calendars inverted their dates, and the very concept of sequence became meaningless as cause and effect traded places. In the deepest part of what had once been St. Gethwin's Hollow, the altar pulsed with increasing intensity, its surface covered entirely with script that moved and shifted like living things. The channels that covered its surface flowed with substances that existed in the spaces between matter and meaning, liquids that were composed of dissolved faith rather than physical matter. Each drop that fell from the altar's surface carried with it the essence of a prayer spoken in reverse, a blessing that had been transformed into its opposite. The gospel leech stood before her altar in the buried darkness, her pale form illuminated by the glow of her own transformed sanctity. Around her the impossible garden flourished, its paper leaves whispering fragments of every prayer that had ever been spoken backward, creating a library of inverted devotion that grew more complete with each passing moment. The sound of scratching filled the air as invisible hands carved names into the walls, adding new entries to the litany of the transformed. But the gospel leech's work was not yet complete. She had been a saint once, blessed with the power to intercede for the souls of the faithful. That power had not been destroyed by her transformation, but had been inverted, becoming the ability to claim souls for a purpose that transcended mortal understanding. Each person who joined her congregation brought her closer to a goal that remained hidden even from those who served her, a final revelation that would transform not just individuals, but the very nature of existence itself. The war continued around her buried sanctuary, but it had become something else entirely, a conflict between different versions of reality rather than between armies of mortal soldiers. The outcome would determine not just who controlled the physical world, but which understanding of existence would become the foundation for all future reality. And in the darkness beneath St. Gethwin's Hollow, surrounded by her garden of impossible vines and attended by her congregation of transformed souls. The gospel leech waited with the patience of eternity for the moment when the last prayer would be spoken in reverse and the world would finally understand what it had always been meant to become. The scratching in the walls continued, names being added to the litany with each passing moment, each new entry bringing the final revelation closer to completion. But the names were no longer carved in stone or wood. They were being written in the very fabric of reality itself, becoming part of the fundamental structure of existence. And when the last name was written, when the final prayer was spoken backward, the gospel leech would reveal the truth that had been hidden beneath the surface of conventional faith, the knowledge that devotion and hunger were not opposites but two aspects of the same eternal need. In the observation posts that ringed the exclusion zone, new guards took up their watch, carrying lanterns that burned with pale light and cast shadows that moved independently of their sources. They walked their patrols with the same steady gait as their predecessors, their boots leaving root-like tracks in the mud as they tended the perimeter of something that could no longer be contained. The scent of wet parchment followed them through the trenches, and their voices carried the echo of backward prayers as they called out the changing of the watch. The gospel leech influence spread through the world like ripples on still water, each wave carrying fragments of her hunger to new shores. In distant cities, people began to dream of pale saints and impossible gardens, their sleep filled with visions of altars covered in backward script and vines that grew from dissolved faith. They woke with the taste of wet parchment in their mouths and the sound of scratching in their ears, marks of their conscription into a congregation that grew larger with each passing night. But the most terrifying aspect of the gospel leech spreading influence was how voluntary it seemed to those who encountered it. The backward prayers did not feel like corruption but like correction, as if the conventional world had been speaking the wrong words all along. The transformation she offered appeared not as death but as awakening, the chance to see reality as it truly was, rather than as it pretended to be. And in the end, perhaps that was the most frightening truth of all. That devotion taken to its logical conclusion became indistinguishable from its opposite. That the difference between saint and monster was nothing more than a matter of perspective. The war would continue, but it would never end, because the gospel leech had transformed it into something eternal. A conflict between different versions of truth that would rage until the last prayer was spoken and the final name was written in reverse. And in the darkness beneath St. Gethwin's hollow, surrounded by her garden of impossible vines and attended by her congregation of transformed souls, the saint who had once been human continued her patient work, adding new names to the litany and drawing the world ever closer to the moment when it would finally understand what it had always been meant to become. The lanterns burned with pale light in the trenches, their flames steady and eternal, casting shadows that moved with lives of their own. And somewhere in those shadows, the gospel leech waited, her root-like limbs spread wide as if embracing the entire world, her hollow face filled with backward prayers that rewrote reality with each whispered word. The scratching continued, names being carved into the very fabric of existence, and the scent of wet parchment filled the air like incense in a cathedral built from dissolved faith.